So what now with the shuttle retired? It will be years before NASA flies another manned mission. In the meantime, Americans traveling into space will need a lift from some former enemies. Elizabeth Palmer reports from Moscow.
U.S. astronaut Katie Coleman is going to work on the space station. Her commute, 220 miles straight up on Russia's Soyuz. If the shuttle was the Cadillac of space transport, the Soyuz is the Honda Civic. Coleman has a poetic way of saying it is rather cramped.
Here you are with a window just 6 inches from your face. It's a very intimate way to be in space.
Now that Soyuz is the only way for U.S. astronauts to travel up and down, NASA keeps a full-time manager at Russia's space complex near Moscow. Commander Mark Polanski, who lives in a suburban-style home built especially for visiting Americans. He was an Air Force officer back when the U.S. and the then Soviet Union were battling for space supremacy.
I was a fighter pilot back when the Cold War was still going on, and if anybody had told me back then when I was flying F-15s that I would be living with my family in Russia, I'd have never believed them in a million years.
1957, the Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite and the space race.
The first man in space.
4 years later, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin went into orbit, and round one went to the Soviet Union.
It's one small step for man.
8 years later, though, the U.S. evened up the score by putting a man on the moon. But the astronomical costs of this race helped bankrupt the Soviet Union and end the Cold War. Only America could afford to go on building space shuttles. The Russians stuck with the 1960s-era Soyuz, which did bring Katie Coleman safely back to Earth just last month.
Does it make you uneasy that there's no plan B anymore? It's the Soyuz or nothing.
I don't think we could have a more dependable alternative than we have right now with the Soyuz.
Dependable, yes, and a monopoly, which lets the Russians charge NASA $60 million a ride, contributing roughly 10% of the entire space budget.
Of course, $60 million buys more than just a round-trip ticket on the Soyuz. Every American astronaut who comes here to the Russian Space Center gets an extensive training program, including a dip in what's probably the world's most specialized swimming pool.
Underwater simulates zero gravity, and this is a lesson in space station repair. But there are undercurrents of resentment at NASA that America's space program is now hostage to Russian technology.
You hear that from them?
Yeah, absolutely. So,
does it make you mad?
No, I think it's political.
Starved for money for most of the 90s, Russia's dilapidated space program seemed to prove they'd lost the space race. Selling seats on the Soyuz to American astronauts at least lets them call it a draw. Elizabeth Palmer, CBS News, Moscow.
As a local anchor in Washington said many years ago about something else, we've come to the end of an area.